Good morning. Thank you for joining me once again as we continue our journey through the life of our Holy Father, St. Francis. We'll begin today, as we've begun each of the last sessions, praying the same prayer that St. Francis prayed before the San Damiano crucifix. I invite you to pray with me. Most High, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. The passion of Francis' life was to carry out the Lord's holy and true command. He was listening to the Lord. His prayer begs for enlightenment. Francis prayed a lot, trusting the Lord would lead him. Francis had been inspired by the Lord to send his band of brothers out preaching life of penance, conversion, but also the good news of the gospel, preaching peace. By the year 1219, which is where we left off last time, Francis is now 38 years old. He had sent brothers out on mission to the Muslims. He himself was determined to set out. Didn't want to ask his brothers to do something that he wasn't willing to do. This was the time of the Fifth Crusade. The Crusaders, on behalf of the Pope, were slaughtering Muslims, Jews, pagans. The church saw it as a holy war. Killing the Saracens was considered a holy act. And they did it under the battle cry of Deus Vult, God wills it. We heard last week that Francis would say, no, God does not will it. But the church saw these people, the victims, as less than human. They weren't interested in converting, but eradicating the Muslims. 5 friars were murdered, beheaded by the Saracens in Morocco. They were the first martyrs of the Franciscan order. And again, Francis didn't want to ask anything of his brothers that he himself wasn't willing to do. He wanted to go to Damietta, which is in the Nile Delta of northern Egypt. It was in June of 1219. Francis sets out on this long and grueling trip by ship. A few brothers went with him. The Crusaders were planning on storming the city, which they did, but they were turned back. 6,000 Crusaders had been killed or captured. Francis took one brother with him, Brother Illuminato, to go to meet the Sultan. Think about how bold this was. Keep in mind that the Sultan and his men had killed or captured 6,000 Crusaders. And here's little Francis wanting to go and meet the Sultan. Some say that he was seeking martyrdom. In any case, it was a highly courageous act for sure. As Francis crossed the enemy line, he was seized by armed soldiers. He was beaten and bound, at least according to Gerard Straub, his wonderful biography of Francis St. Clair, The Sun and Moon over Assisi, describes this situation. Francis repeatedly shouted the Sultan's name, thinking him maybe an emissary of the church. He was taken to meet Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil. The Sultan had become ruler of Egypt in 1218. He was known for his mercy and humility. He had offered the Crusaders Jerusalem if they would leave Egypt. But the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius, wanted nothing to do with bargaining. He wanted to destroy. What ensued was most remarkable. Francis said to the Sultan he was sent by God to announce good news. His presence there was not part of the Crusades. Author Julian Green writes, "There seems to be no doubt that Malik al-Kamil was unforgettably impressed by Francis, and that Francis himself discovered a new humanity in the person of his host. You see, he went in open. He went in with respect. He went in humbly. The notion that he had of Islam had to be modified. The essence of faith, belief in God, could be found outside of Christianity, Francis found, and that belief deserved respect. This broad view of the problem of religion was enormous, almost revolutionary. Francis made a difference. The only way to win over souls is by gentleness and by honest example. Francis saw Muslims not as heretics living outside of God's order of salvation. He saw them as people of faith, of great faith, whom God was present through God's grace. Francis was impressed by their prayerfulness, answering the call of the muezzin 5 times a day. The muezzin is a servant of the mosque who would announce this time for prayer. His approach to Muslims was simple, Francis's was. Accept the other as brother. Francis proposed that his friars be nothing more than a simple, peaceful presence among the Muslims, a gentle witness to the depth of the Christian life. Several years ago, friars from the United States requested permission to go, to live among the Muslims, not to preach, but to be this simple, peaceful presence, to live there with respect, to work with their hands, because they knew that such presence is powerful in doing God's will. Where many in the church went among the Muslims with power and the sword, as we saw, Francis went among them in a spirit of humility and respect and nonviolence and peace. According to one historian of the time, when they were parting company, the Sultan said to Francis, "Pray for me that God may deign to reveal to me the law and the faith that is more pleasing to him." Perhaps we can see why Francis was such a radical force for change in his time, in our church's history, and in the history of civilization. I said in my very first talk, I believe that Time magazine named him as one of the 10 most influential people in the history of the world of the last 1,000 years. What Francis is doing when he visits the Sultan gives evidence of his importance. Notice the change, Vatican II of our church, in its declaration on the relation of the church to non-Christian religions, writes, "The church has a high regard for the Muslims. Over the centuries, many quarrels and dissensions have arisen between Christians and Muslims. The Sacred Council now pleads with all to forget the past and urges that a sincere effort be made to achieve mutual understanding." What a powerful quote. How different from the church's view many centuries earlier that Muslims were to be destroyed, eradicated. In his classic Francis, the Journey and the Dream, Father Murray Bodo romanticizes the meeting between Francis and the Sultan, but so beautifully captures the heart of what happened. The Sultan seemed moved by what Francis had poured from his heart, Bodo writes. In a soft voice, so that only Francis could hear, he said, "O little beggar and man of dreams, I wish in my heart that there were more gentle men like you to balance the hatred in the world. Unfortunately, the world understands only two things, power and violence. Someday the world will be turned upside down by little folk who fast and pray and who die rather than take up the sword. Till then, God's will is performed through violent men like me," the Sultan says. And Francis responds, "Will you, Lord Sultan, pray for that day?" The Sultan, "I'll do more, honest man. I'll let you walk out of this camp alive so that you can pray for that day. And I pray that after I'm gone from this earth, Allah will change his mind and use instruments like you, and that this great army of peace-loving beggars will outnumber the forces of hatred and violence. Go to your dreams, brave little man." What a beautiful accounting. And Allah, God, has used a great army of peace-loving women and men down through the ages. I mentioned that Francis founded 3 orders. The Order of Friars, the first order. The Order of the Clares, the second order, contemplative women. But there is this vast army of today called the Secular Franciscans, or Third Order of St. Francis. There are over 300,000 of them in the world, far bigger army than the Franciscan Friars or the Clares for sure. Francis called them the Third Order of Penitents. It's both women and men, married and single, persons of all professions. In their role, if I may read, it says that members shall not bear arms. Arms serve no purpose for the little ones who put their trust in God. Last night, we had a meeting with the Latino-speaking parents of our school children. The night before, we had our Anglos. The church was largely filled with proper spacing both nights. Our principal spoke and brought everybody on board what's going to happen this school year. But I was grateful that he permitted me to say a few words to open up the evening both nights. In English the first night, in Spanish the second night, we prayed the prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. And you know the rest of the prayer. Grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand. It's by dying that we're born to eternal life. I prayed that prayer both in Spanish and English because our children will pray that every day at St. Clement. Now, it's the prayer of St. Francis. St. Francis didn't write it, though. It was written in 1912 by a Frenchman. It was attributed in 1927. In 1927, I learned, to Francis because it appeared on the back of a holy card and Francis' picture was on the front. But it certainly captures the spirit of Francis' visit to the Sultan and its effects on the work of the early friar missionaries who went out preaching peace, of the secular Franciscan sisters and brothers who are peacemakers by their profession, and by this beautiful story we heard. And I pray, brothers and sisters, that that prayer of St. Francis, or at least that in your hearts, with those words or with other words, you can say truly to the Lord, make me, Lord, an instrument of your peace. And watch what God can do in you. Thank you, and I look forward to next week.